Chapter 4, Predecessors to the Counseling Profession, from Antiquity to Early Social Work, Psychology, and Psychiatry. So basically, what we're talking about in Chapter 4 is how humans have tried to understand human behavior from since we could understand things, right? So antiquity, right? Antique, I guess. And then we're looking at how the professions of social work, psychology, and psychiatry have influenced counseling, because counseling is really the youngest helping profession. And all of these older helping professions really have an influence, and we're going to talk about what that influence looks like. So, understanding the human condition from early antiquity to the present. Interesting word choice. So, people have attempted to understand the human condition since the dawn of time. Shamans were viewed as caretakers of the soul. They believed to have mystical powers, all the way back to ancient Egypt to early philosophers. Hippocrates offered suggestions such as for treatment of melancholia. I'm doing air quotes, but you can't see me. But sobriety, exercise short of fatigue, regular and tranquil life, and bleeding if necessary. I'm sure you've heard of leeches to bleed out toxins if yeah. And then for hysteria was marriage, I guess, apparently. But the point of that is just to show that we've always been trying to figure ourselves out. This has always been an interest. So the history of social work is kind of where we're going to start. So social work, psychology, and psychiatry professions originated in the 19th century and heavily impacted our profession. They've maintained their unique identities, but they have moved towards many of the same theoretical orientations. That's why a lot of people get them confused, because they do overlap. That's the reality. So they can be seen today as being parallel, but slightly different paths. So starting with social work, if we take a look at some of the key milestones in the history of the social work profession, we can start with the roots go all the way back to the Poor Laws of the 1500s in England. And these were early government efforts to provide relief to the poor, though often in the harsh and stigmatizing ways. They laid the groundwork for how society thought about helping those in need. So that's kind of the point with making with those. Um, but a lot of times they were stigmatizing. The main themes I see in the poor laws are they categorized into the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. So, like the deserving poor, one of the laws was that they were like if you were elderly or disabled, you were allowed to beg, but if you were not those things. If you were able-bodied, they thought, well, you should work. And so if you were caught begging, then you were labeled a vagrant and you were punished. And so that's why it was stigmatizing. You could also be, if you were a vagrant, you could be essentially human trafficked. So the poor laws, it laid the groundwork for, okay, we're looking at this, and there were compassionate people who wanted to help and do something about that. Anyway, moving forward, we see the rise of charity organization societies. In the 19th century, volunteers called friendly visitors would go to people's homes offering moral advice and basic assistance. While this often reflected middle class values being imposed on the poor, it was one of the first organizations' attempts to provide structured support. So these were the earliest social workers, the friendly visitors. They're just trying to help people. And at the same time, the settlement movement emerged, led by reformers like Jane Addams at the Hull House in Chicago. And so, unlike the charity organizations, these are settlements in neighborhood. These were neighborhood centers that emphasized living and working alongside the community, addressing not just individual needs, but also like larger societal needs like housing, education, labor, things like that. And so together, these movements paved the way for the first social work training programs and for approaches like casework and group work and community organization. And by the 1940s and 50s, the focus of social work had shifted more towards families and social systems, reflecting the growing influence of systems theory. And the profession continued to formalize. In 1955, the National Association of Social Workers was founded, and by 1965, the Academy of Certified Social Workers was established to set professional standards. So that's kind of like our CACREP. Theirs is this ASCW, the Academy of Certified Social Work. And so today, social workers can be found in a variety of settings like schools, hospitals, mental health centers, child welfare policy, things like that. And so it carries forward that long history of balancing individual support with broader social change. And that's kind of the keystone of social work is that broader social change. Um, so that's kind of just touching on social work and Um, the way it influenced counseling is, first of all, systems. Family and social systems perspectives have become a K-CREP requirement focus. I teach the family systems class, and we talk about how it's not you have to look at it an individual in the context of their family, of their community, of their larger social context. And so that's a big influence. Second influence of social work on counseling is field experience. That's so important. Your practicum, your internship, getting out there and actually practicing it under the support of your faculty and supervisors, site supervisors. So that's critical in counseling training. And then the third is advocacy and social justice. So social work's focus on advocacy and social justice is important for us. I actually did my dissertation on the difference between social work and social justice in counseling because when I worked in a community mental health center, I felt like I was doing social work and I didn't feel quite trained for what was being asked of me in this high needs population. So if you're interested in that, I can give you that citation, if you want to read my dissertation article. But anyway, this is all very interesting to me, kind of how social work and counseling kind of coexist and how they influence each other. All right, so now we're shifting to the psychology profession. I would say this has the biggest influence on counseling. Um, it just originated in with Greek philosophers, think Hippocrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Aristotle's actually considered the first psychologist. Used objectivity and reason to study knowledge. Now you think of the research, right? As a psychologists are heavy on the research. All right. So in Europe, the first experimental psychologists like Wilhelm Wundt and Francis Galton studied human differences and similarities. Wundt, often called the father of psychology, focused on scientific study in consciousness, and Galton explored measurement of traits like intelligence. And so around the same time in the United States, experimental psychology was also emerging. Figures like James Cattell and G. Stanley Hall, who became the very first president of the American Psychological Association, were key in establishing psychology as both a science and a profession. And we also see William James contributing to philosophical perspectives called pragmatism, which emphasize that truth and reality are not fixed, but they're continually shaped by human experience. Think social constructionism. And so the late 1800s and early 1900s also brought growth in the psychological testing area. So think about Binet, who developed the first intelligence test. You may have heard the Stanford Binet intelligence test. That's kind of where that came from, as well as the rise of vocational assessments and personality testing that are still used in various forms today. So other important influences came from figures like Mesmer, whose ideas about mesmerism eventually evolved into hypnosis, and Charcot, who used hypnosis in treating patients with neurological disorders. And hypnosis is still a thing. People get trained in it. Dr. Montgomery, who you may have eventually for a class, she's trained in hypnosis. And Terry Wright, who I work with in her group practice, she's trained in hypnosis as well. So hypnosis is still a thing, believe it or not. And it's evidence-based. So anyway, of course, no discussion of psychology would be complete without Sigmund Freud. So he developed psychoanalysis, which introduced ideas about the unconscious mind, early childhood, and talk therapy. So psychology's beginnings blended science, philosophy, medicine, and testing, laying the foundation for the diverse field we know today, psychology. All right, so late 1800s to early 1900s, we started getting different schools of thought in psychology. And think Pavlov's dog, the classical conditioning, when the bell rings and the dog salivates, that was Pavlov. Phenomenological psychology. Phenomenology means a person's individual experience. Existential psychology. You should read, if you're interested in this, read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. That's a really, really great book. Really, the first half of that book is the best part of that book. And then Gestalt psychology, think Fritz Perls, Empty Chair, things like that. And if you look at this over here, this picture to the right of all of these psychological theorists, they're all just pretty much a bunch of old white men. So just important to note. So the above schools led to cognitive behavioral and existential humanistic therapies. You may hear about the forces of counseling. And so it started out as three forces of counseling. When I was getting my master's, there were four forces. So the three forces of counseling, the foundation is psychoanalysis, right, with Freud, and then behavioral, and then humanistic. And that's like with Carl Rogers and person-centered counseling. The fourth force is multiculturalism, and now even more evolved, we have a fifth force, and that's social justice and advocacy. So that's kind of the evolution, and those are the driving forces of counseling practice. So anyway, the mid 1940s, we had Division 17, which is counseling psychology. And weirdly enough, my master's degree, I actually have a master's of science in counseling psychology because in 2008, CACREP was still accrediting psychology master's programs, and they don't so much anymore. And the reason is because they want the core faculty to have a PhD in counselor education. And all of my faculty in my master's program had a PhD in psychology. So I got a CACREP education, but I was educated by psychologists. And then my doctorate was everyone was a counselor educator, and it was CACREP, and it was 2014 is when I graduated with that. So, and by that time they had kind of phased out accrediting psychology programs. So it's just kind of crazy how that stuff evolves. So today, experimental psychologists, clinical and counseling psychologists, school psychologists, and then psychologists in business and industry. So there's psychology in all facets. And it has the most influence on the counseling profession than the other professions. It used the first comprehensive approaches to counseling and therapy, thinking about all of those theorists like Pavlov and classical conditioning and the existential psychology, and Carl Rogers was a psychologist, and that's what your basic skills are even based on is Carl Rogers' approach to psychology, because it's person-centered, and that's where we get our basic skills from that you'll learn next semester. And then research techniques, like I talked about earlier, evidence-based practice, that came from psychology because they were the first ones to start really doing empirical research on this kind of stuff. Right. All right, so now moving on to psychiatry. Mental illness originally was mystical and demonic, and they were people with mental illnesses were treated horribly. If you go back and read about what quote unquote insane asylums were like, they were giving them ice baths and painful shock treatment, which shock treatment is still a thing today, but it's not painful and it's actually therapeutic, and there's research behind it. It was just quite different back then. But it was really barbaric, but we just really didn't know what to do with people who had severe mental illnesses, and it was pretty bad. And so, Pinnell in the late 1700s was the founder of psychiatry, and he was one of the first to view mental illness scientifically. Benjamin Rush and Dorothea Dix were some of the first advocates for the humane treatment of the mentally ill. And then um, the original American Psychiatric Association, kind of like we have ACA, they have APA. It was first called the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane. Now it's just the American Psychiatric Association. But anyway, the early 1900s, the historical background of psychiatry, the early 1900s, many psychiatrists were into psychoanalysis. So they got that from psychology. And then some moved into psychobiology and others into social psychiatry. So that was the early 1900s. 1950s and 60s was the expansion into psychotropic medications. It was probably the start of Big Pharma, honestly. But that's when they started doing research on and how we could alter the brain's chemistry to relieve some of those severe symptoms. And then in the 1950s, the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it's a great book to have on the back of your toilet if you just want to read through something, it's interesting, I'm sure that if you've got a psychology background, you have probably already kind of thumbed through it some. But you'll have a whole class in DSM. But in the 50s and 60s, they really started operationalizing this and defining it and coming up with this disorders. Now we've got the DSM-5, and I think they're on the revised version of the DSM-5, and that's where we are today. 1960s, psychiatrists needed to work on community-based mental health centers after Donaldson versus O'Connor, which we'll talk more about this era of mental health and counseling in your next chapter in the history of counseling. But in the 1960s, early 60s, JFK really introduced some important bills that impacted how mental health centers are run now. And how counseling operates now. Mental illness is seen as mostly or partially biological, at least through psychiatry. And then psychiatrists today often consult with counselors. The reason that we have a DSM class is to develop a common language of this stuff. And school counselors and mental health counselors, you all take this class now. It's very useful. Even though this is a medical model class, you're going to be collaborating with people that operate on that medical model, and you need to understand the language and the symptoms and the all of that stuff. So that's why we include this class. So the importance of psychiatry is on the counseling profession is because of diagnoses. Even though, right, we're a wellness-based profession, we're on the wellness model, we still are required to diagnosis a lot of times to diagnose clients because that's how you get reimbursed through insurance. And it also can just be helpful for the client. A diagnosis can really help the client find some relief that they're not alone and that there's an explanation and that they can start to understand what's going on with them better. And then also the contributions is that illnesses may be organic. And so, trying not to lose my voice. Illnesses may be organic. So it used to like schizophrenia, right? Schizophrenia is a brain disease, but it used to be thought that schizophrenia was caused by very dysfunctional family dynamics. That was the earliest, and we'll talk about this in my family class, but they used to think that it was poor parenting that created schizophrenia, but that's not the case. It's actually a brain disease and it can be treated with medicine. And then so psychopharmacology that goes into that. How we talked about how the most effective, that counseling is as effective as medicine, but the combination of both is the most effective. So psychopharmacology is important. That's outside of our scope of practice. We don't tell clients what medicines they should take, but we can kind of get an idea when it's time to refer a client to seek consultation with a psychiatrist. So we have to know enough about it in order to collaborate, to consult with a psychiatrist, but we're not expected to prescribe medicines, obviously. So that's it for chapter 4. To-dos and reminders. If you haven't already read the chapters, go ahead and read those and take the quiz and write the reflection for the week. And don't forget that your interview with a counselor, it doesn't have to be an LPC. I think in the chapter 3 lecture, I said LPC, but it doesn't have to be an LPC. If you're a school counselor, you probably won't find an LPC. You could also do it with a PLPC, somebody working towards licensure, but interview with a counselor. Don't be interviewing a social work, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist. We talked about all those today and how they influenced our profession. And now we want you to go out and talk to someone in our profession. So those are your to-dos and reminders. And I'll see you next week.